Good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of the Introduction to Buddhism. So let me just quickly put up the outline for this week. Our topic this week is what is meditation? And in particular, we're going to continue where we left off last week with Vipassana and talk about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which is the Vipassana teachings are set out in the Satipatana Sutta. So we'll start by talking about the twofold practice of Shamatha and Vipassana. And then we'll go through the 4 Satipathanas, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, starting with body, then going on to feelings and sensations, then mind, and finally talking about the mindfulness of phenomena, or what Rinpoche calls references. All right. So when Rinpoche talked about the overall aim of meditation, he reminded us that really there's 2 things we're trying to do. First is to realize that we have the observer, the cognizance that we've talked about before. And in fact, to remind ourselves that this is the most important thing that we have. And the second thing is to learn to recognize and then become free of the filters that distort our perceptions, that prevent us from seeing reality as it is. So I'd just like to do a brief recap of what we covered in weeks 3 and 4, since they very much lead into what we're going to do today. So firstly, in week 3, we talked about the observer, our cognizance, which we sometimes refer to as mind or awareness. And we talked about why it is the most important thing that we have. It is our authentic nature, right? The spirit or the nature of the Tathagata or the Buddha. And we learned that means having gone or going beyond samsara and nirvana. If we can realize this authentic nature, that is liberation or enlightenment. We also learned that Tathagata means gone and arrived from where you have never departed. Right? So although we may not experience our Buddha nature today, we have never departed from it. But we don't realize that we have it. We're like a poor man living on top of a vast buried treasure right underneath his house. So we need to go on a transformational journey, like the hero's journey described by Joseph Campbell, to discover what we already have. Right? This is the Buddhist path. We talked about authenticity and how although we have this cognizance, this Buddha nature, most of the time it is covered, so we can't see it properly or at all. It's like raw cabbage covered with Thousand Island dressing, or like a window covered with dirt. But even when our window is covered with dirt, it remains clean, right? The dirt is removable. It's adventitious, something extra that is separate from the glass itself. It's not an impurity that's part of the glass. And because our window has always been clean, we can clean it, right? Underneath the dirt, there is always a clean window. We can be awakened from our confusion. And the Buddhist path identifies this dirt as negative emotions, such as lust, anger, delusion, which are themselves based on clinging and craving, all of which are rooted in wrong views. We experience unsatisfactoriness and suffering because we do not see reality as it is. We are ignorant about the reality of ourselves, other people, and the world around us. We have wrong views. But by identifying and then deconstructing these wrong views, we can clean the dirt from our windows and realize that we have this observer, this cognizance, which is the nature of our minds. It might sound difficult, but it's not actually that complicated. It's like a child looking at a stage where there's a performance. There's a demon dance and the child gets scared. But the moment the child goes backstage and realizes that it's just a man wearing a mask, that's the end. That's the end of that wrong view, the illusion of the demon. The child is now free. Okay, so then in week 4 last week, we had an introduction to Vipassana, which is the Buddhist practice of learning to see the truth, learning to be free from the filters and distortions that prevent us from seeing reality as it is. We started to pay attention to the observer, this cognizance. We learned to practice mindfulness, to develop an observational stance towards our experience. And we started with the experience of our own body and our breathing. And we realized that when we observe and bring our awareness to our experience, we see that it has 3 characteristics. The first is impermanence, or anicca. Everything is changing, shifting, drifting, always in flux. Phenomena are always coming and going. Nothing stays the same forever. You breathe out, it's gone. But there's nothing magical about that. It's just the raw truth. Right? We might think change is bad, but change is also good. It allows fresh things to come into our life. Change is decay, but change is also growth. Right? Change brings challenges, but it also brings opportunities. Okay, so that's the first. We saw impermanence. Next, we saw unsatisfactoriness, or dukkha. Right? Nothing is 100% satisfying. There is no magic potion that can make us live happily ever after. There is no philosopher's stone that can turn lead into gold. Even the pleasure of our favorite ice cream wears off after a while. And we might look longingly at the beautiful kitchens and exotic sports cars of the rich and famous. We might imagine that our lives might be so much better if we had skin like all our Instagram idols. But even if we were to live in the perfect house, after a while we would get fidgety, anxious, distracted, bored. We cannot escape our own minds. And as long as our experience of reality is built on distorted perceptions and wrong views, we will always end up with unsatisfactoriness, disappointment, and suffering. So then the third thing we notice, if we start practicing Vipassana, is non-self, or Anata. And we started with the body. We noticed there is no truly existing or unchanging self. There's no true identity, not even any true characteristics. There's no thing that's truly thin or truly fat, truly beautiful or truly ugly. All these phenomena come together and arise based on causes and conditions. We realize they're just conventional labels and designations. I'm sitting at a table. Right? It has legs. There's a piece of wood on top. I have a cup of tea on my table. But if I were to sit on the table, then suddenly it has become a chair. The table is gone. It has no fixed identity as a table. Now, we learned last week about the Me'en people of Ethiopia when they were presented for the first time with photographs of people and animals. They were completely unable to read the 2-dimensional images. They felt the paper, sniffed it, crumpled it, listened to the crackling noises it made, even nipped off little bits and chewed them to taste it. For the Me'en people, there were no photographs in their reality, even though they were holding them in their hands as plain as day. They saw nothing but shiny paper. As we familiarize ourselves with the practice of Vipassana, we begin to understand the extent to which our reality is constructed. Just because something appears a certain way to us doesn't mean that it appears that way to others, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's real. Our experience of having a self may be very strong and persistent and compelling right now, but perhaps we might be starting to become open to the possibility that things are not always as they appear. Maybe the demon dance isn't quite what we think. And so with that background, we come to week 5 this week. And we're going to continue to explore the practice of Vipassana, learning to become more aware of the ways in which we misperceive reality. And we're going to continue to familiarize ourselves with the truth. We'll also start by practicing Shamatha, or calm abiding, which brings the calm and serenity that many people associate with meditation. And more importantly for us as Buddhists, it allows us to stabilize our awareness so that we can better practice vipassana and observe our experience. And then we'll spend most of our time on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, as set out in the Satipatana Sutta, which is one of the most famous of all the Buddha's teachings. It sets out 4 domains of experience in which we can apply and practice vipassana, successively exploring deeper, subtler, and more profound aspects of our experience and our sense of self. So let's begin with a classic example of a glass of muddy water. We can't see anything through the glass. So what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is we can stop moving the glass, right? Just let the mud settle. And this is shamatha. Right? If we stop moving and shaking the glass, then all the mud will settle to the bottom. Now, so the word shamatha, it has 2 parts. The shama means tranquility, calmness, rest, equanimity, the absence of passion. And the ta means abiding, right? Sort of stabilization. It's a little bit perhaps like the feeling of peace and relaxation we might experience after a massage or a good yoga class or perhaps a warm bath. But at some point we have to get out of the warm bath, right? Our glass of water is going to get shaken up again, and very soon all the dirt and the mud will be everywhere, right? It'll be all muddy again. Yes, we can have another bath or massage tomorrow, but the only lasting way to get a glass of clean water is to remove the mud and the dirt. And that is the purpose of vipassana. As we saw last week, vipassana means cleaning the mud, right? Cleaning the dirt on our window. So vipassana has this meaning of seeing something extra, something special, the real deal, the true color, right? The true nature. Right? Seeing through or past or beyond the dirt, and thereby freeing oneself from the dirt. Right, we talked about this last week. We'll go into it more deeply this week. And shamatha and vipassana are basic elements of all Buddhist practices, right? From the simplest Zen meditation to the most complex Tibetan practices, from offering a single flower to cultivating love and compassion for all sentient beings. And there are many rich traditions of cultivating wisdom, mindfulness, compassion in Buddhism, such as the practice of the 4 immeasurables and the 6 paramitas and the bodhisattva path, and the vast skillful means of the Vajrayana path. But all that is for another time. So here we're just going to follow Rinpoche's focus in his teachings over the last couple of years, where he very much focused on shamatha and especially vipassana. But just again to say, these are the foundation of all Buddhist practices. Right? So if we can start to understand how these function, it'll enable us to make much more sense of our Mahayana practice, our Bodhisattva practices, our Vajrayana practices. So shamatha, right? How do we practice this calm abiding? Well, it's very simple. It really is all about focusing and settling our awareness on a specific object. Right? It could be a Buddha, it could be a stone, it could be a flower. Of course, in the tradition, all the masters recommend using a Buddha, right? Whether a visualized one or an actual image. And it helps with refuge, with bodhicitta, with tantra. There are other kinds of shamatha practice that don't actually use a specific object. For example, we could be focused and undistracted on a state of love and compassion, right? Not aiming at any specific being, but extending to all beings, like sunshine emanating from the sun. You can also practice shamatha with the object of emptiness itself, or even mind itself, right? Not aiming at the objects of cognition as if they existed on their own. And this method of focusing to attain shamatha is the one used in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and actually is very similar to the way Rinpoche taught it. I'll explore that more today. Now, last week we already started what was a shamatha practice when we used breath as the object of our vipassana practice. And we introduced it in the context of vipassana because we were looking into the nature of our breath and our body. But it was also a shamatha practice because whenever we became distracted and our awareness drifted away from the breath, we brought the awareness back to our object of focus, which in that case was the breath. So let's just very briefly practice that now. Right, so bring your awareness to your body, your feet, your legs, your hands, your arms, your torso, your body as a whole, your head, your eyes, your ears, your nose. And maybe you're aware of the movement of the breath coming in and out of your nostrils. Maybe you notice it's slightly cooler on the in-breath, slightly warmer on the out-breath. Now notice the movement of the breath in the body, the rising and the falling of the abdomen, and just follow the movement of the breath in the body. Maybe you become distracted. That's okay. Gently bring your awareness back to the movement of the breath in the body. Okay, so very, very brief, but you can continue that 5 minutes, 20 minutes, a couple of hours. Right? That is the practice. It's the practice of shamatha. And as you keep going with that practice, you will progress to deeper states of concentration and clarity. They're known as the jhanas, and they're described in detail in the Pali commentaries. Right. And in fact, many other traditions also have practices like shamatha. It's pre-Buddhist, by no means exclusive to Buddhism. For example, in Hinduism, the idea of shamatha with the single-pointed focus and concentration of mind is the same as the sixth limb of Ashtanga Yoga, right, which is Raja Yoga, right, which is concentration, or dharana. Other meditation traditions, for example, transcendental meditation, can also be considered shamatha, because there you have a practice of silently repeating a mantra. Yeah. And although the TM organization says that focused attention is not prescribed, and that the aim is a unified and open attentional stance, nevertheless, it's not vipassana, because we're not focusing on trying to see the truth. So yes, there are many other traditions, and indeed even Christianity, other traditions, many religions have practices of contemplation with specific objects or icons, religious images, candles, and so forth, all of which can help to cultivate this quality of calm abiding, help the dirt settle to the bottom of the glass. But in Buddhism, our purpose is not just concentration and calm, but seeing the truth. And for that, we need vipassana to clear away the dirt, and that practice is unique to Buddhism. Although shamatha is often taught as the first stage in the practice, in order to strengthen our awareness, develop stability, which we can then apply to observing phenomena in vipassana. But shamatha and vipassana are practiced together. Right? They're not taught in the sutras as two separate techniques, but rather two aspects of practice. Now, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha never mentions independent shamatha and vipassana practices. They're always taught as two qualities of mind to be developed through meditation. When he tells his disciples to go and meditate, he never says go do vipassana. He always says go do jhana, which is the Pali word for meditation. And in the few instances where vipassana is mentioned, it's almost always paired with shamatha, not as two alternative methods, but as two qualities of mind that a person may gain or be endowed with, and that can be cultivated together. Right? Similarly, Ajahn Brahm, who is from the Thai forest tradition, he says, some traditions speak of two types of meditation, namely insight and calm abiding, but the two are indivisible facets of the same process. Calm is the peaceful happiness born of meditation, and insight is the clear understanding born of the same meditation. Calm leads to insight, insight leads to calm. And in all cases in the Theravada tradition, shamatha ultimately is used to develop insight into the three marks of existence that we talked about already, right? The anicca, dukkha, anatta. So jhana is induced by shamatha. Then this meditative state of jhana is reflected upon, observed with mindfulness, becoming the object of vipassana. And then it is seen that jhana is marked by the three characteristics. And then that, in turn, leads to insight and ultimately to liberation. So that's sort of the background to the practices. I'm not going to say more on shamatha right now, but please, the questions are open. So if anyone has any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I want to turn now to the Satipatana Sutta. Right? It means the discourse on the establishing of mindfulness. And it's one of the most celebrated and widely studied discourses in the Pali Canon of Theravada Buddhism. And it's also the foundation for all contemporary vipassana practice in the modern world. And famously, the Buddha declares at the beginning of the sutra, he says, "This is the direct way, monks, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the extinguishing of suffering and grief, for walking on the path of truth, and for the realization of nirvana." And so obviously it's a good thing for us to practice, right? Just remember, right, the thing we're trying to do here, twofold. We're trying to pay attention, become aware of our observer, right? We have this, it's our nature. And with vipassana, we're trying to observe phenomena fully, without interference, open-mindedly. And as we said last week, your observer is there all the time. Right this moment, you are conscious of something. Let's pause for a moment. Find out, what is that? So this is it, right? Our cognizance, our observer. We're going to use it as we might use another instrument, like a knife, or like a scientist might use a microscope. And observing without influence, right? Without theories, religion, science, politics, directly, without a story, without trying to interpret or make sense. We're not trying to confirm or find anything that we've read about or theorized about. It's raw observation, raw mindfulness, or Rinpoche said raw awareness. By the way, it's beyond our scope today, but for those of you who are wondering why he wanted raw awareness rather than raw mindfulness, that's the difference between the Dzogchen, the Mahasandhi tradition, and the Mahamudra tradition. But nevertheless, for our purposes, mindfulness, awareness, both good, right? And so this word Satipatana, the establishment of mindfulness, or the presence of mindfulness, or alternatively the foundation of mindfulness, right? What does that mean? So the word Sati in Pali, that means mindfulness. And the word Patana has this sense of presence or standing near or attendance upon. Right? It conveys the impact that the practice of Sati has upon its objective domain. Right? It makes it present to the mind, makes the objects of awareness stand near the mind, makes them appear clearly before the mind. You might even ascribe the Utpatana to the subjective rather than the objective side of the experience. It is the mind's activity of attending to the object, the awareness of the object. Upatana can also mean setting up, and that's what one does with mindfulness. And there are 4 domains or 4 broad categories that we are invited to apply our mindfulness to. Going from the more gross to the more subtle, from probably the least, as Rinpoche said, important, to the most important. And here Rinpoche gave the example of an Americano, right? It's coffee and water, basically diluted espresso. Rinpoche said it's basically watered down coffee, but marketing people don't like saying that. Actually, the term caffè americano is Italian for American coffee, and there's a popular story that not confirmed, that the name has its origins in the Second World War, when American GIs in Italy would dilute espresso with hot water to approximate the coffee to which they're accustomed. In any case, the point is your Americano has to have at least espresso and water as elements, right? And so Rinpoche is saying similarly, as we think about the elements or aspects of our experience, our awareness, when we think about self and phenomena, there are 4 different things which we're invited to look at, right? So I'm going to go through them quickly first. The first is body. Right? Kaya is the word. This includes the 5 senses. It includes tactile sensations, physical sensations, the body itself, breathing. I already talked about this. Right, the next one is feelings or sensations, Vedana. And those are the sensations aroused by perception. The sensations could be pleasant, they could be unpleasant, they could be neutral. Right, psychology would call this the valence or the hedonic tone. Right, the touch of a feather might be pleasant, or it might be ticklish and unpleasant. Right, so it refers to the raw tone of sensations before any emotions or narratives or stories. Right, so it doesn't mean feelings in the sense of emotions, it means feelings in the sense of sensations. Right, the third Satipatana is mind or citta, and this refers to all mental events. So thoughts, also emotions, dreams, imagination, and in particular includes the presence or absence of the 3 poisons of greed, anger, delusion. Mind is such a big topic in Buddhism, and the later schools of Buddhism developed much richer and more complex theories of what mind is about. But we won't go into that today. We'll just talk about a very simple awareness of mind. And then the 4th of these Satipathanas is dharmas, right? And that has 2 different meanings, right? It can mean the Dharma teachings themselves. And actually in the Satipatthana Sutta, there are various elements of the Buddhist teachings listed as objects of mindfulness, including 7 factors of awakening, including the 4 noble truths. Right? And the 7 factors of awakening include mindfulness itself. Right? So in this 4th Satipatthana, we are starting to come into meta-awareness or meta-cognition, right? Starting to be mindful of our mindfulness itself. But then also becoming aware of the presence of the 4 noble truths in all that we see. right? Seeing the truth everywhere in all phenomena. Now, the second meaning of Dhamma is just phenomena itself. Or Rinpoche said it can also mean references or views. And he gave the example, if we think that tiny feet are beautiful, but you have a shoe size that's 14, you'll be very upset. And people think a flat belly is good. You might walk around all day trying to suck your belly in, paranoid you might forget to do that. Likewise, phenomena include all our values, ideas, democracy, socialism, red party, green party, yellow party, Trump lover, Trump hater. Right? According to the Mahayana and Madhyamaka, all phenomena are just projections due to our own references or our own views. Right? So once we understand that, we see that when we talk about dhammas or phenomena, this fourth Satipatana actually includes all phenomena, all references, all views. Right? And indeed, the Dharma path itself, right, the teachings, the practices, even nirvana, even enlightenment, these are all included as part of relative truth. Right? So we can start to see now these two definitions start to come together, right? Phenomena and Dharma. But Rinpoche cautioned us that when people talk about vipassana in the West, it includes body and feelings most commonly, but very rarely mind or phenomena. Maybe just give an example of these four. So imagine you're going to something like the Met Gala, a black tie event in New York. Right? Maybe for the body, you look at your shoes, you see how shiny they are, you see the light reflecting, you notice the completely smooth surface where you have shined them. You notice your tuxedo is soft and silky to the touch. Yeah, it's all form, it's all body. And feelings and sensation. As you look at your shoes, as you run your fingers against your sleeve of your tuxedo, you experience a pleasant sensation in your body. Right? The shoes are beautifully shiny and elegantly proportioned. It's just lovely to look at. You get a sort of warmth, sort of uplifting kind of feeling. The tuxedo feels very pleasant to the touch. And then let's go to mind. Maybe start to feel pride. Right? Maybe you start to imagine how people are going to think you're well dressed. Maybe your mind is wandering to how you've been a little lonely during the COVID lockdown. Maybe you're hoping you're going to meet someone special. Maybe you might even find love here at this gala. And then the fourth, right? Dhammas, phenomena, references. Maybe you came to this outfit because you've been studying all the previous Met Galas and looking at the best dressed men, and you've put together your outfit in a way that you feel pushes the boundaries but not too much. You think it's stylish and elegant but edgy enough to be interesting. And you can see, just in this example, one can imagine getting caught in any or all of these aspects of experience. But likewise, if you can start to see the three marks in any of them, right? If you can see that any of these aspects are impermanent, they're unsatisfactory, they have no self, then it can start to break down the whole illusion. Okay, so returning now to body, right? So we've already said it includes all the things we normally associate with our form. 34 inches, six-pack, arms, legs. And here we're only going to be practicing a gross version, right? We're not going to go into detail like our sense organs. The bodily faculty of vision is much more than our eyes, and even in the traditional Buddhist teachings, let alone in modern neuroscience. And of course, our body is a very big part of who we are. Right? Who is sitting here? Who went to the toilet just now? Who is getting hungry? It's like the water in the Americano. So we'll observe the body. No prayers, nothing mystical. And when we are aware of the body, it's just noticing, just observing, just being aware. No narrative, right? No story. So nothing like I have a body, because that's now moving into narrative and self-talk. It's no longer observing the body. Just be aware. Right? You don't need theories. At times, just parts, nostrils, your eyelids. Have you ever stopped to pay attention to those? Just how amazing they are. Sometimes you might go from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. Sometimes from your head to your toes. Sometimes from a finger on your left hand to a finger on your right hand. Sometimes the whole body. But if that's all a little too abstract for you, then bring your awareness to breathing. Right? Just be aware of breathing in and out. And notice the way Rinpoche, by the way, in giving these instructions, he's not trying to give us a fixed routine or a fixed form. He's giving us an invitation to be creative, to keep our practice fresh, right? Not to turn it into yet another habit. This is his approach to all practice. I think it's great to practice even here. Okay, so let's just do that for a moment. So sit straight. You can blink your eyes if you need. Don't do it deliberately. Don't move or adjust your position. Don't cough. Don't scratch. Rinpoche used to say, don't even swallow. If saliva collects in your mouth, let yourself drool. I'm not going to insist on that, but really the more discipline you can apply, the more you can notice just the body itself. And this practice is a lot like the Shamatha practice, but here we're adding the awareness of the nature of the body and the breath, right? We're not just seeing the surface, the pasana. We're looking more deeply. We're doing the vipassana, right? We're observing that our body, our physical form, has these characteristics, these three marks of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and no self. Okay, so it's a very brief session. Just a minute. Just be aware of the body. Okay, and as we saw last week, as you continue to be aware, to observe, you will see the impermanence, the movement of the body, the movement of the breath. You'll notice the unsatisfactoriness, and you'll notice there is no self to be found. Now, what's interesting is that Rinpoche was saying, when we're doing meditation on the mindfulness of the body, we don't generally observe things like he said, Taipei 101, the skyscraper behind him. That's what he was teaching in Taiwan. I mean, for me, there's a tree behind me, a Douglas fir. I don't necessarily observe that. I may have a general idea that it's there, but I'm not observing it, right? So kaya, which is the domain of the first Satipatana, it means body, but it means form, right? It's more general. It refers to all physical forms. And actually, even in the Theravada Vipassana, we observe both self and others, right? Other people, other forms outside us. All the versions of the Satipatana Sutta also indicate that each of the four establishments of mindfulness are to be contemplated first internally, right, so ajata, then externally, bahida, and then finally both internally and externally. Right? And that's generally understood from the commentaries as observing oneself and observing others. Of course, in the Theravada, we're much more focused on observing just persons. In the Mahayana, we extend that much more to also observing phenomena. But even so, right, it's not just about self, right? So the internal vipassana is looking at self, external vipassana is observing others, and then internal and external both is the system as a whole, right? The whole field, the relationship between internal and external. So we start to move much more now to a non-dual practice, right? Going beyond self or other to observing self and other, ideally simultaneously. And we'll talk more about that next week. And by comparison, I would say most contemporary mindfulness practice is almost completely self-oriented, right? One could say it's quite narcissistic. I focus on my own body in such a way that reinforces myself and downplays everyone and everything else. There's a much more general critique of the contemporary self-help movement, right? That it does end up reinforcing narcissism. So yeah, even just this first Satipatana, the mindfulness of the body, there's a very big difference from the way that Vipassana is practiced in the contemporary West, or indeed how meditation in general is practiced, right? There's much less focus on self-awareness in Buddhism, right? Much more focus just on awareness. Now, I think the other thing I wanted to touch on is Rinpoche's point that right now we're not really observing, right? We just have a vague idea. So he said, if we were really to observe a building like Taipei 101, we would see details that we're not currently paying attention to, right? Its greenness, its spaciousness, so many things, right? The raw observational details. And this is also a big subject in Western psychology. I want to show you a short video by Professor Daniel Simons, who's Professor of Psychology at the University of Illinois. He studies awareness and attention. So I'll just show you the video and let you draw your own conclusions.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
Okay, so I must say when I first saw that, I was really quite delighted by it. So yeah, let's just spend a moment thinking about this idea of vague impressions, right? Because usually we go straight to seeing a phenomenon, right? A labeled object. So for example, in that video, there was a number of people throwing a ball, but instead of counting 6 people, it just became a group of people, right? It became a vague phenomenon. And so we didn't miss it when one person just disappeared, right? Likewise, there was a curtain in the background and it was red at the start, but it just became classified as background in our mind, right? So we missed then that it changed color. Likewise, we were focused on the players in white, not those in black. So when a black-colored gorilla enters, even though it's pounding its chest right in front of us, we don't even notice. And this is a very wide finding in psychology. Yeah. So just to reinforce the point that Buddhism's trying to make here, we have to train our awareness, our observer, even though we have it. Our distraction, our ability to get caught up in wrong views is, going to keep us from seeing what's actually going on. A different but lovely story about observation from Robert Pirsig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He was talking about how a professor had been having trouble with students who were having difficulty writing. And at first he thought it was laziness, but it became apparent that it wasn't. They just couldn't think of anything to say. And one of them, a girl with strong lens glasses, wanted to write a 500-word essay about the United States. And he was used to the sinking feeling that comes from statements like this, and suggested, without disparagement, that she narrow it down to just Bozeman, which is a city in southern Montana in the Rocky Mountains. But when the paper came due, she didn't have anything to say. She was quite upset. She tried and tried, but just couldn't think of anything. And he'd already discussed her with her previous instructors, and they'd confirmed his impressions. She was very serious and disciplined and hardworking, but really quite dull. No creativity in her. And she wasn't bluffing him. She really couldn't think of anything to say. And she was upset by her ability to do as she was told. And it just stumped him. Now he couldn't think of anything to say. And then he thought, why not narrow it just to the main street of Bozeman? A stroke of insight, right? She nodded dutifully and went out. But just before her next class, she came back in real distress, tears this time. She still couldn't think of anything to say, and she couldn't understand why. If she couldn't think of anything about all of Bozeman, at least she should have been able to think about just one street. And he was so upset. You're just not looking, he said. He thought, the more you look, the more you see, but she just wasn't looking and somehow didn't understand this. And so he said, look, narrow it down to the front of one building on the main street, the Opera House. Start with the upper left-hand brick. And her eyes behind her thick lensed glasses opened wide, and she came into the next class with a puzzled look and handed him a 5,000-word essay on the front of the Opera House on the main street of Bozeman, Montana. I sat in the hamburger stand across the street, she said, and I started writing about the first brick and the second brick. And then by the third brick, it all started to come, and I couldn't stop. They thought I was crazy. They kept kidding me, but here it all is. I don't understand it. Yeah, so I think something quite important there about noticing our own habits around observing, around getting caught in generalizations, getting caught in vague ideas, not paying attention. So in all the phenomena of our life, all the people in our life, what is that top left-hand brick of the Opera House, right? How can we start to really see things rather than just our vague impressions? Now, apart from this phenomena being vague and unobserved, there's another way we fall prey to vagueness and lumping things together. And that's when we fail to separate the observational data from our interpretation, right? Our story, the phenomena. So for example, we probably all have an idea about what it means for someone to be rude. But have we really considered what we're observing, what we're paying attention to when we label another person as rude? So I grew up in the UK to an Italian father and a German mother, so three very different cultures. And for those of you who know a little about European culture, you'll know that the English culture and the Italian culture are quite different. Yeah, so in England, if you're having a dinner party, one is polite, one doesn't interrupt, there's decorum. Interrupting and talking over people is considered highly rude. Whereas in Italy, very different. Right there, the culture is very extroverted, and actually engaging, interrupting, talking over is a sign of just how much fun you're having, how much you're enjoying the conversation. Right, so let's imagine for a moment how these four aspects of mindfulness might play if I were an English person, indeed, which I am, and I was having dinner with an Italian friend who started interrupting me. At first, I would notice body behaviors, right? I would notice his voice, his talking over me, his interruption. Right? Sensation. I would notice that my body is starting to tense up. Maybe I'm getting a little flushed. It's not a pleasant sensation. And my thoughts, maybe I'd start to experience my friend as rude. Maybe I start getting upset. Maybe I remember last time I was in Italy and how I didn't really enjoy myself because everybody was like this. And fourth, my phenomena, my references. If you were to ask me why these things are, in my experience, I'd say, well, look, English manners and culture, they're superior, right? It's really important for parents to bring up their children well, to be polite and well-mannered. I hope you realize, of course, I don't really believe this. I mean, this is just trying to be English. Now, of course, if I were not a Vipassana practitioner, I probably wouldn't be noticing any of those things. I might just turn to my friend and say, look, I find you to be very rude, and I request that in future, please, could you listen to me more carefully and not interrupt? Now, if I were Italian with an Italian friend, perhaps I would notice the same external behaviors, although perhaps even then I might be paying less attention to how much my friend was saying, perhaps more to the expression of joy on his face, maybe the smiling, the laughter, the twinkle in his eyes. But then the second, the third, the fourth foundations would all be different. Right? Instead of telling him how much I was finding it to be rude and how upset I was, probably I would tell him I was delighted, that I was so happy that he was enjoying the conversation so much. Yeah? So there you see two identical sets of external behaviors, but two completely different reactions. So as a Vipassana practitioner, as I start to observe, to pay attention, I can start to see that it's not the external behavior that's driving my experience and my reaction. I can start to see how it's all constructed. I start to see the anicca, the dukkha, the anatta, right? The impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness, the fact there is no true nature or self or identity to this experience. And this is just an example of a very practical application of Vipassana. Just learning to see that what we think is happening in the world and what we're perceiving is not actually what's driving our interpretations, our reactions. It's possible to cultivate a very different interpretation or reaction for the same set of behaviors. As we said much earlier, we can learn to cover our own feet with leather rather than having to change the whole world and cover the world with leather. Yeah, I just also want to talk a little bit about one other application of observing the body, right? Observing form. And this is more a sort of Mahayana application. When we think about bodhicitta, when we think about compassion, because all too often when we think of other people, we just have a vague idea of them. We don't actually observe them, right? We think of them in terms of vague categories like gender or race or physical characteristics like short or tall or what have you. And then we judge, just like an Englishman might judge the manners of his Italian friend. And I think it's really important for us to learn to see past these judgments and to observe people for who they are. Now, there was a lovely piece in the New Yorker a few years ago written by Paul Bloom. It's called The Root of All Cruelty. And he was reflecting on a recent episode of the television series Black Mirror, where there was a soldier hunting down and killing hideous humanoids called roaches. Standard science fiction scenario, man against monster. But the twist was, it turns out the soldier had a brain implant that made him see the faces and the bodies of targets as monstrous, right? To hear their pleas for mercy as noxious squeaks. And the hero's implant fails, and he discovers that he isn't a brave defender of the human race. He's a murderer of innocent people, right? Part of a campaign to exterminate members of a despised minority, just like, the Jews in Europe in the 1940s. And so the philosopher David Livingstone Smith was commenting on this and wondering if its writer had read his book Less Than Human, which explores human cruelty and really the idea that acts like genocide happen when we fail to appreciate humanity, when we fail to actually observe and see others. Right, so for example, the attitude of slave owners, the 17th century missionary Morgan Godwin observed they believed the Negroes, although in their figure they carry some resemblances of manhood, yet are indeed no men, but rather creatures destitute of souls, to be ranked among brute beasts and treated accordingly. Isn't that incredible, right? Just a couple hundred years ago, people actually thought their fellow man had no souls. Right, then the Holocaust. Right, and here Paul Bloom says, like many Jews my age, I was raised with stories of gas chambers, gruesome medical experiments, mass graves, an evil explained as arising from the Nazis' failures to see their victims as humans. Right, the inhibitions against murdering fellow humans are generally so strong that the victims must be deprived of their human status if systematic killing is to proceed in a smooth and orderly fashion. So that's why the Nazis used bureaucratic euphemisms like transfer and selection to sanitize different forms of murder. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, he noticed humankind ceases at the border of the tribe or the linguistic group, even sometimes the village. Right? And today we see this everywhere. Google your favorite despised group, Jews, blacks, Arabs, gays, whatever, along with words like vermin, roaches, animals, and it will all come spilling out. Right, a lot of this rhetoric is clearly inappropriate for mainstream discourse, but wait long enough and you'll hear the word animals even used by respectable people, referring to terrorists or to Israelis or Palestinians or undocumented immigrants or deporters of undocumented immigrants. And it shows up in the speech of white supremacists, but then also when the rest of us talk about white supremacists. And it's not just words, right? At Auschwitz, the Nazis tattooed numbers on their prisoners' arms. Throughout history, people believed it was acceptable to own other humans. And there are explicit debates in which scholars and politicians mulled over whether certain groups, such as blacks or Native Americans, were natural slaves. Even in the past century, there were human zoos where Africans were put in enclosures for Europeans to gawk at. Right? We might think that Nazis are somehow different from the rest of us, but actually now we see dehumanization is everywhere. Right? Outraged members of the public call sex offenders animals. Psychopaths treat victims merely as means to their vicious ends. The poor are mocked as libidinous dolts. Passers-by look at homeless people as if they were transparent obstacles. Dementia sufferings are represented in the media as shuffling zombies. Yeah, so I think it's worth pausing just to notice our own observation, not just of ourselves, but of other persons, other beings. Right? To what extent are we practicing loving kindness and compassion? Are we able to see beyond whatever judgments and references we might have? Can we really be impartial? Okay, so with that, we shall take a 10-minute break. I will see you after the break. All right, so welcome back. We're now going to turn to feelings or sensations. And as I've mentioned already, the Pali word Vedana, it doesn't mean emotions, or it doesn't mean feelings in that sense. It means feelings in the sense of basic sensations that are aroused by perception, right? Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So it could be very gross sensations, like swallowing wasabi, or very subtle sensations, like anxiety, like feeling ill at ease. And again, this is a sensation prior to the emotion, just noticing how it shows up in our senses, in our body. And we know that paying attention to our bodily sensations is a very good way of becoming aware of our emotional and mental state. And many of us, especially in the modern world, are really out of touch with our bodies, right? We don't have a lot of body awareness. So, of course, practicing things like yoga is wonderful, but practicing this second vipassana, of really learning to pay attention to our bodily sensations, is very important. Again, our job is not to analyze these feelings. Right? As Rinpoche said, we can do that in psychotherapy, right? It's just to observe. No judgment, not even asking, where is this coming from? Why is this coming? Not speculating about what it means, where it's leading, what's going to happen next. Well, yes, there is a time for that in therapy and so forth. But during Vipassana, we're not doing that, right? So Vipassana is different from therapy in that respect. In Vipassana, we are just observing. It's just awareness. And although this isn't directly part of the Buddhist path to liberation, I just wanted to touch a little bit on the importance of body and sensation, especially when it comes to trauma. If you haven't read it, there's a wonderful book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, all about trauma. And it turns out that trauma is far more widespread than we might imagine, right? And of course, if one broadens the definition to consider, other forms of trauma beyond a large scale sort of violence or abuse, more like uncontrolled expression of emotion, parents who are overly controlling and so forth, there are ways that probably all of us are in some way affected by traumatic experiences of our childhood. And part of what's so interesting about his book is that even though our bodies are aware of what's going on, our minds very often suppress this reality. Right, so I just want to read a little bit from what he says. He says, look, we need our parents and caregivers to take care of us. And so the moment we give up on our caregivers when we're little kids, we're done for. And so the way the child is wired is to stay as close to the people who are supposed to take care of them as possible. And with that, they will deny the reality of being beaten. Or the imprint is very much like, I'm being beaten or I'm being molested because I'm a bad person, right? I must deserve it. So your identity then becomes basically, I'm a bad and flawed human being. If I'd been a nicer, a better child, people would have loved me and taken care of me. If I'd been a worthwhile child, people wouldn't have done these horrible things. And actually, as a therapist, when you get into treating these issues, the hardest thing to treat is this deep sense of being defective, where people feel something's foundationally wrong with them. John Bowlby, the attachment researcher, he really showed how children need to cling to their caregivers and will do anything they can to keep a semblance of connection going so they don't die or get abandoned. And the price they pay is this very profound sense of self-loathing, self-criticism, despising yourself. You may get into a lot of difficult behaviors thinking, well, I'm no good anyway. There's a deep sense of, I might as well put myself in danger or take drugs or whatever because I'm no good anyway. People come to rationalize their very bad feelings, and that allows them to survive to some degree. But, the core part of your brain that's paying attention to the body, to the sensation, is picking up all of these threats and danger signs, and it keeps continuing to secrete stress hormones, leading to immunological abnormalities, muscle tension, fibromyalgia, a whole bunch of physiological symptoms where the body continues to behave as if it's in great danger, while the mind says, oh, don't pay attention. He's lying, he's a terrible person. So there's a very real conflict between the body feeling very unsafe and the mind not wanting to accept the reality of what has happened as being caught to this. Yeah, so hopefully most of us haven't had experiences that are like that, but all of us have some form of fear. Maybe we don't like speaking in front of a large room. Maybe we're afraid to go up to the attractive stranger at a bar and introduce ourselves, right? There's all kinds of ways that our body is telling us one thing and our mind is telling us something else. And that disconnect is part of a fundamental lack of awareness. Right? So really learning to be mindful of the sensations of the body. It's not just going to help us as our path to liberation, but if we're trying to understand and get past some of the dirt on our window, it's really good to pay attention and be aware of just what's going on, because so many of us have suppressed a lot of this material, a lot of these memories, and so it's difficult for us to move past it. Okay, I'm not going to go into more detail now, and I'm not going to practice this. Often I think the easiest way to practice the first two forms of vipassana is just to do them together, right? So as you're doing the mindfulness of the body, also do mindfulness of sensations, right? Feelings of pleasure, pain, and indifference. Okay, so let's turn to mind, which is a much bigger topic, much more pervasive than body or sensation. And mind is much bigger than intelligence or ability to comprehend. After all, even if you're not comprehending something, you know that. So who's knowing that you're not comprehending? That's also mind. All sorts of feelings, feeling left out, feeling alienated, feeling proud, all kinds of emotions, all part of mind. Now, the Pali dictionary translates chitta as heart or mind, right? Emphasizing that it's more the emotive side of mind as opposed to manas, which is intellect in the sense of what grasps mental concepts or objects. Other translators emphasize that it represents the whole mindset or state of mind, right? It's a term used to refer to the quality of mental processes as a whole. Some translate it as consciousness, some like to say state of mind. Bhikkhu Bodhi says the third foundation of mindfulness actually refers to observation of states of mind. And since mind in itself is just the bare awareness of an object, states of mind can only be distinguished through their associated factors, which give them distinctive coloring. So it's actually through noticing the different states or qualities of mind that we can start to contemplate and observe mind. And Rinpoche said, let's make this simple. Mind is that which cognizes things. And again, just a reminder, we're trying here to realize that this single most important thing that we have is the cognizer, the observer, and we're trying to become aware of and ultimately free from our filters and distortions. Rinpoche said, you have this observer, you have this cognizance. How much are you using it? He said probably less than a fraction of a percent. And even then, through so many filters, so many sunglasses. That's like having green sunglasses or orange sunglasses or yellow sunglasses. All these filters of being a man or a woman, a Buddhist, different social, political, religious values, so many filters on top of one another. So, yeah, to see reality, we need both, right? We need to look. We need to use this observer rather than just space out to live habitually, live unthinkingly, or indeed, as we saw earlier, just to fall back into these vague ideas where we're not really paying attention at all, whether it's to phenomena or to people. And then we can't see reality if we're only seeing our filters, right? Like we said in week 4 with the Me'en people, they couldn't see the photograph. They literally didn't know what it was. Okay, so let's go straight to practice. And Rinpoche gave 2 different versions of the practice, and I'm going to do both. So the first one is more a classic Theravada tradition of observing the mind. Right, so as usual, sit straight. Try and avoid movement, swallowing, scratching, what have you. Start by observing the body. Fingers, head, belly. And as you observe the body, observe the observer. So as you do that, your mind must already have gone somewhere. No need to search for where it has gone. Observe your breathing in and out. As you observe the breathing, observe the observer. Okay, so stop there for a second. So maybe you just want to reposition yourself in your seat. I'm going to take a sip of tea. Okay, the second version of this mindfulness of mind is much more one that will be familiar to the Tibetan tradition. Okay, so this, rather than observing, is knowing. So again, start by sitting straight. There's some sort of cognizance happening right now. Very least, cognizance of my voice. Maybe it's depression, sadness, maybe longing, maybe peace, maybe curiosity. Doesn't matter. You're not a table, so some sort of cognition is happening. And just know that as it is happening. Don't recall, oh, I was thinking about dinner. Yeah, that's sort of okay, but not so good. No. Could be silly, could be creative, could be sexual, could be violent, could be dreamy. You only have one thing to do. Just know what is happening. And if nothing seems to be happening, no thoughts, that's fine. That thought, there is no thought, is also a thought. Just know that. And if no thought comes, don't consider that good and try and keep it. If you're aware of thoughts and able to maintain awareness, don't think that's good and try and keep it. It's nothing special. If many thoughts come and you feel that's not good, you feel agitated, don't try to stop them. Don't judge this as if it's something bad. Lots of clouds, no clouds, there's no difference to the sky. Okay. So, I think for many of us, especially if we're new, that might seem a little abstract perhaps. So I wanted to go through some of the questions and answers from Rinpoche's teachings, as I think it'll give a little bit more sort of context and structure for us, especially if we're very new to this. So one question was, somebody said, I feel like I'm locked in a steel coffin sinking into the sea when I observe this I, this self. And Rinpoche said, just observe, don't do anything. Even if there's a formula, don't apply it. Now, as a beginner, that may not satisfy you. Right? We have such a paracetamol mind. Right? Everything has to be fixed right away. You also call this a tea bag mentality, which I rather like, right? The idea we can't wait to brew tea properly from tea leaves. We need an instant tea bag. He said, just watch that feeling low. Bank on it, right? It's the most economical. No side effects and lots of discovery. In a couple of months, you'll want this feeling low, like a fisherman who doesn't want to fish in an empty stream. I just want to say, look, this is really, for many of us, quite a radical way of approaching our practice, because we're so used to wanting to apply some kind of antidote, right? Especially now in our modern consumerist society. Part of the curse of consumerism, the curse of technology, is we're trained to expect and demand something convenient, right? A quick fix. And I think it's all too easy as Dharma practitioners to take that habit into our Buddhist practice, right? This search for quick fixes and convenience. So I suspect renunciation in the modern world really needs to include going against this desire for a quick fix, for convenience. Otherwise our mindfulness will really just become therapy to improve samsara, not liberation. And in this comment that you'll become like a fisherman who prefers a river full of fish, Rinpoche used the example of a surfer, right? As a beginning surfer, you learn on small waves. But beyond a certain point, you can't keep getting better unless you start to surf on bigger waves. And in fact, once you become a good surfer, there's absolutely no fun being on a small wave. You want a big wave, right? The bigger the wave, the more the enjoyment. Right? This is a very standard experience of mastery in any field, right? As we become better at whatever it is that we're practicing, the frontier of our comfort zone, the demand for more challenge and less need for support. Rinpoche often talks about this in terms of the forest glade and the charnel ground, right? I mean, in the sutras, the Buddha said we should leave the town and go to a quiet place in the forest if we want to practice. And for beginners, that's wonderful and much recommended. Yeah, but once you become experienced, then, for example, in the Vajrayana, it's considered that the most auspicious place to practice is a charnel ground, right? A place where dead bodies are buried or left out for the vultures and crows to pick at. And it's considered a place kind of filled with negative energies and spirits and so forth. And yet that's the most auspicious place to practice once you become good, because it's a challenge. Yeah, it's pushing you, just like the big wave pushes the surfer. And so we'll talk about this more in future weeks, but a big part of the art then of practicing Dharma is to make sure we have the right balance of challenge and support. Right? How much do we need our environment to be like a forest glade? And how much are we ready to take on more challenge, right? The bigger wave, the charnel ground. If, as he says, for a good practitioner, having lots of emotions come up is actually something that the practitioner knows how to delight in, because they're no longer caught up, they're no longer reactive. In the Vajrayana it is said that 1,000 emotions are 1,000 wisdoms. And Rinpoche says, this is achievable. You might think this sounds like very high level practice, but he said it's easier than a six-pack. Right? And he said, I've met many practitioners very able to surf with their emotions, especially at the time of death. It also, as we think about Shamatha and Vipassana, I think you'll see that Shamatha really is about doing something, right? We're bringing the awareness back to the object. Whereas Vipassana has this quality of doing nothing. We're not doing anything, we're just aware, we're just observing. Right? So even when we have a thought that says, oh, I'm aware of a certain emotion, I'm aware of a certain thought, that is already a thought, right? It already has a subject and an object. Just know that. Yeah. So let's practice again. Just really emphasizing this time, just knowing whatever is happening, right? Not seeking to do anything, not seeking any antidote, not seeking to redirect our awareness. Yeah. As Rinpoche said, if you're thinking about a coffee shop and your mind goes to the wine shop, don't think I have to finish the coffee shop first. No need. Wherever your mind is, just be there. Okay, so just for a couple minutes, you can use either method, or either the method of observation. So first practice observing body or sensations, and then observe the observer. Or second method, just knowing whatever is happening in your mind. And the moment you know, most likely the thought will disappear, but don't treat this as a victory, it's nothing special. Okay, so just do it for a couple minutes. Okay. So, some more questions. Somebody asked, isn't mind the same thing as observer? She said, oh, we get so excited. Wow, mind, I can see it. But a much bigger thing is that mind knows itself. He said, I shouldn't even say that. Mind is self-awareness, like a lamp that illuminates itself. Now, if you're new to meditation, you'll feel that it's one mind looking at another mind. But keep doing it, and the wall between observer and observed will collapse. Right? You'll come to know that there is no object independent of the subject. And this is non-duality. And we'll talk more about this in week 6. It's also, by the way, a lovely answer to the question of how do I know the signs of progress in meditation? I think one really nice one is the extent to which you still feel there is a wall between subject and object. Another question. If I understand the nature of mind has no coming and no going, how should I practice in my normal life and my work? And Rinpoche said, don't worry about theories like no coming and no going. Just observe mind, preferably this moment mind. And I think when he says that, of course, if your mindfulness is more remembering what has just happened in the past, it's still helpful in the sense that you can see the nature of that thought, that experience, as having those 3 marks: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and no self. But because it's in the past, although you can learn from it, there's nothing you can do about it. Right? What we need is for our vipassana to be applied to the present moment experience, right? What's happening now? Because that's the only time that we can actually make choices, right? Do anything different. So for our practice to be useful to us, we need to learn to do it actually in the present moment, right? Not even to recently experienced thoughts and phenomena. So Rinpoche said, most beginners will start their practice of the 4 Satipathanas sitting. And if possible, then start to momentarily introduce it here and there in post-meditation. So for example, when you're walking around, walk in the park, walk around the block, and indeed, hence walking meditation as a practice in Buddhism. But also, things like the Japanese tea ceremony. Rinpoche introduced the idea of an onion meditation. He said now things are getting very individual. He said your coach might tell you to chop the onion very thinly, very finely, very carefully, very gently and delicately. Or he might say, chop it coarsely and vigorously into big chunks. That's a personal instruction. But he said, in either case, during the time of chopping the onion, just observe. And of course, you can't chop an onion in the traditional sitting meditation, right? So already you're starting to integrate your vipassana into your post-meditation, into your worldly life. Rinpoche continues, after a few months, you can apply observation, vipassana, when you're arguing with your partner. And it's essentially the same. Whether it's a tea ceremony, chopping onions, flower arrangement, arguing with your partner, you're trying to blend your observation, your mindfulness, your awareness with what you're doing. So there's this quality of being that is there simultaneously with the action, with the doing. And like we just said with the forest glade and the charnel ground, of course you should only try to do this to the extent that you can master it. So that's why for beginners, the forest glade, the secluded meditation practice, separating yourself for half an hour a day from your worldly activity is the best way to cultivate mindfulness, Because if you try to, as a beginner, cultivate it in the middle of an argument with your partner, that will be like being a beginning surfer and trying to take on a 50-foot wave, right? You have no chance. Yeah? So you need, or we all need as beginners, to take time for practice, to dedicate ourselves to building up our habits, our skillful means, our awareness, our mindfulness, our shamatha, our vipassana. And then slowly, as we get stronger in the practice, then we can apply it, right, in more challenging, more demanding situations. And of course, once you are able to see the nature of phenomena, once you see the 3 marks in everything, in the flower arrangement, in the onion chopping, in the argument with your partner, then it will change. Right? We talked last week about if you see the 3 marks while building a sandcastle with the child, then your attitude to building the castle will change. And likewise, your attitude will change if you find yourself in an argument with your spouse. You'll have a very different perspective on what you previously would have seen as a conflict. Yeah, but how many of us are yet at that stage, right? Obviously, we need to practice. And I'm always reminded by the lovely quote from Bruce Lee, the martial artist. He said, "Under duress, we do not rise to our expectations, but we fall to the level of our training." Yeah, I think it's the same here. So let's keep investing in our training so we don't fall so far. Okay, so turning finally to the 4th Satipatana, right, the mindfulness of dharmas or phenomena or references. And actually this is quite interesting because there's very little agreement, even amongst Theravada scholars and commentators, about what this means. Right? There's very little specific advice on how to practice the 4th Satipatana, and the commentators disagree on its meaning and interpretation. In fact, even the texts disagree because there's different versions of the text. And some of them, when they talk about the dharmas, will give a complete list of the 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the 4 noble truths. But actually, in analyzing all of these different texts, Analayo, he says the only ones that are shared by all the early Pali sources are the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening. Yeah, so I can understand why Rinpoche noted that this is left out of more contemporary mindfulness, and certainly the Burmese Vipassana revolution in the 19th and early 20th centuries that we talked about last week. But it is very unfortunate because we end up leaving out the view. And if you leave out the view, then the very heart of the practice goes missing. There's an interesting observation made by the Buddhist scholar Robert Boswell Jr. He said that by the 10th century, Vipassana was no longer practiced in the Theravada tradition due to the belief that Buddhism had degenerated and that liberation was no longer attainable until the coming of the future Buddha Maitreya. And it was only reintroduced in Myanmar and Burma in the 18th and 19th centuries, giving rise to the modern Vipassana movement. Yeah, so I don't know, but I'm very curious about whether that kind of lack of a practice lineage has actually also contributed to the lack of, a consistent commentarial tradition and understanding. The word, Dhamma is often translated as mental objects, but again, Analayo argues this translation is problematic because the first 3 Satipathanas, of body, sensations, mind, they are also mental objects in themselves, right? So he says, maybe a better word would be mental factors and categories, or classificatory schemes, or frameworks to be applied during contemplation. And Thanissaro Bhikkhu argues that the 4th Satipatthana is about the qualities of mind developed and abandoned as one masters the meditation. Yeah, so Analayo says the main thrust of this fourth Satipatthana is the path to awakening, and therefore the contemplation of the Dhammas is really like a shorthand description of the path. Yeah, so in a way, as I think we've already said, this fourth Satipatthana is equivalent to saying practice all of the Dhamma path. But I find Rinpoche's reading much more interesting in the sense that he's referring to references and views. Yeah. So all phenomena, all experiences are views, but not just all phenomena, also all the teachings, right? All Buddhism itself, all ideas of nirvana, enlightenment, all of that is equally just conventional relative truth. Right? Rinpoche said, your practice then becomes a practice of it's there and it's not there, applied to everything. And we'll talk about this much more in week 6. It is interesting actually that the Tibetan approach to Satipatthana is a little different. In Jigme Lingpa's commentary in Treasure of Precious Qualities, he says the 4 applications of mindfulness are emphasized in the Mahayana with a focus on emptiness. He says if one practices according to the Theravada, one meditates on the impurity of the body, on the feelings of suffering, on the impermanence of consciousness, and on the fact that mental objects are ownerless, right? There's no self to which they belong. But if one practices according to the Mahayana, then during the meditation session, one meditates on these same things as being space-like, beyond all conceptual constructs. And in post-meditation, one considers them illusory and dreamlike. So when he taught this, Rinpoche paused and he said, just take a moment to listen to the sound. I don't know what sound is there for you. Or when Rinpoche taught, he was hearing the air conditioning, and I can hear a quiet hum from the fan on my computer. But he said, this idea of air conditioning, this idea of a machine blowing out cold air, we only relate to it as a phenomenon of air conditioning because of our training, our education, and so forth. Yeah, likewise, I only understand that this is a fan on my computer because I have concepts for this phenomena. If I was a cat, I wouldn't know what it was. Yeah, I might still see the form, I might still have the sensation of air blowing from my computer, but I wouldn't have this fourth vipassana of a whole phenomenal world. It's like the example we've come to before, right? The me'en and the photograph. And Rinpoche said, look, why are we here? Yes, we're here because we have a body, we have sensations, we have a mind. But really we're here because we're curious about Buddhism. And that curiosity is a phenomenon, which in turn is driven by all kinds of other phenomena, our upbringing, books we've read, friends we hang out with. And somehow that leads us to this interest in Buddhism, in enlightenment, in vipassana. All of these are phenomena. Right, so I think this is why this fourth aspect of vipassana is so important, because views and phenomena, as we saw last week, they are the root cause, right? So learning to see these views, these references, once we understand and can see the empty nature, right, of these views, they'll all start to fall apart and deconstruct. Rinpoche said, our phenomena are always vague. We're called a relative truth. Even if you think about form, think of a triangle, think of a square, a highway, a street lamp. These are vague ideas and categories. And yet, we think that someone is a normal, healthy person if when they look at a street lamp, they say, wow, this is a street lamp, not, oh, this is a nice cucumber, right? And even, phenomena like beautiful or a long time ago or countless, they're very vague, but they work. They're saying there are countless people. It works. And of course, there are other phenomena like society, like herd mentality, like fitting in, like rebelling. Yeah, maybe one of us loves Louis Vuitton and just wants to sort of do everything we can to get more of that. Maybe someone else says, no, I'm going to rebel. I don't value that at all. I want to wear a chipao. But that's no better than fitting in with the herd, right? Fitting in, rebelling, they're just more phenomena. Yeah, Rinpoche's talked elsewhere, and we'll come back to this also, about the idea of being both elegant and outrageous, where you're neither stuck with fitting in nor stuck with rebelling. It reminds me, actually, there's a lovely quote from Confucius where he says, the master said, the gentleman agrees with others without being in echo, and the small man echoes without being in agreement. So, I don't want to go into too much detail now on the actual inclusion of the Four Noble Truths in the Satipatana Sutta. I think, though, probably that the importance here is, well, firstly, that we learn to see that even the Dharma itself is just a path, right? It's not something to be clung to forever. We don't want to make it into some holy ultimate truth. But also, I think this idea that if we are properly practicing the fourth vipassana, we are learning to see the truth in all that we observe. Right? So it's another way of saying we learn to see there is no self in all phenomena. Right? There is this quality of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness. So that's another way of thinking about it, right? It just becomes a universal application. I just want to close by talking a bit about what Rinpoche said, the Dharma is a placebo, right? The path is just a trick. He said, so often when we think about ethics, when we think about morality, when we think about even religion, it becomes a very sort of solid, very ultimate, very black and white kind of thing. But for us, our Dharma practice is not an ultimate holy truth, right? It's a trick, right? It's a way of getting rid of the dirt on the window. But as we saw, the window is already clean in any case. The dirt isn't even real, right? So it's not as if the Dharma is leading us to some clean window that we didn't previously have. We already have our cognizance, our observer, our Tathagata, our Buddha nature. But nevertheless, we still need to practice. Yeah. So, just another sort of reminder. Phenomena are all constructed. They're all compounded. They're all put together, and they'll all fall apart, right? The classic word is to say they're transitory collectives that are put together and labeled as specific phenomena. Like a scarecrow, like drawing a circle in the water. The Zen master Dogen said, when birds fly in the sky, they leave no trace. When fish swim in the water, they leave no trace. All phenomena are like that. Body, feelings, Four Noble Truths, all the way to enlightenment. Nothing remains. All is like a phantom. As we analyze, it will all fall apart. And yet, it's not a negation, right? Basically, it's there and it's not there together. That is how Buddhists see phenomena. Okay, so that is something we're going to cover in much more detail next week. But for now, maybe let's close now with just one more moment of practice. And again, I invite you to do whichever of the versions of Vipassana we have discussed. Maybe you wish to do just mindfulness of the body. Maybe mindfulness of the body together with mindfulness of sensations. Maybe mindfulness of the mind, maybe observing, maybe just knowing. Maybe all of them together. But let's just do it for a minute. Okay, so with that, I thank you. I bid you farewell. I know there's some questions already. If you'd like to come to the questions and answers, we'll be restarting in 10 minutes. Please, there's still an opportunity to ask questions. Go to the Google form. And otherwise, I very much look forward to seeing you next week. And I strongly encourage you, please, between now and then, do put some time aside to practice this observation, to practice this awareness, practice this vipassana. Start learning to see phenomena closely, not just our vague ideas. Start to become aware of their impermanence, their unsatisfactoriness, their non-self. And remember also, don't apply any antidotes. There's nothing to do, nothing to fix. Wherever your mind goes, just be there. Right? Just know whatever thought, whatever emotion is coming up, it's okay. If there's some negative commentary, if there's some positive commentary, some sense of upset or despair, some sense of frustration you can't do the practice properly, some sense of pride at what an amazing meditator you must be, whatever comes up for you, just know it. So with that, again, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Right, so welcome back to the questions and answers. So first there's a question from Lydia. She says, I have some questions about the mind. I've noticed that I can use imagination to take myself out of a situation. I've also noticed that when doing mundane tasks such as eating or bathing, I may be imagining the whole thing. Is this natural, or am I continuing to be distracted? Yeah, so I think, I guess a couple of answers. The first one was just as Rinpoche was saying, as we've said all the way through today, wherever your mind goes, whatever narrative or thought comes up, just know that. Right? So if there's an imagination, that's just something else to know. It's like, okay, that's what's happening right now. I am imagining. And if you're using the imagination to take yourself out of a situation, just pay attention to that. It's like, wow, I'm noticing that's what I'm doing. Right? So whether or not we call that distracted, I think distraction is a word that's much more used in terms of the shamatha practice, right, where we're really trying to build a stability of attention and awareness. But as Rinpoche said, once we become better at the practice, it's like surfing, and the surfer doesn't remain static on a wave, right? He moves with the wave. I think that's part of the reason that analogy works well, right? Our job is not to try and freeze our whole mental process, which would be impossible in any case. It's instead to stay present with whatever is happening right now, and just know that. So Lydia continues, if these are distractions, is there a difference between when I'm fantasizing in my head and when I'm eating and bathing? Yeah, this is a great question, and I think once we become more aware in our practice, we start to realize that all of our so-called experience, whether it's more out there in the world or whether it's more inside our own head, all of it has this quality of the three marks, right? It's all constructed. It's all projected. It's all a virtual reality that our brain is creating as a show for us. So while we're used to some feeling more real and some feeling more imaginary, and of course it makes a difference in terms of the real world, actually in terms of the way it's produced, the mechanisms are the same. A final part of Lydia's question, is there a point where the imaginations stop altogether, or do they never stop? And so is practice a matter of developing the ability to experience them accurately? Yes, that's right. Yeah, the mind is by its nature, luminous, right? It keeps producing thoughts and emotions. At the Mahayana we say, form is emptiness, yes, so none of these thoughts or emotions have a solid identity, but as the Heart Sutra also says, emptiness is form. And so even if there is a seemingly empty space, immediately it'll be filled with form of various kinds, right? It's interesting, this is even true in the world of physics. Not that I want to go there too much, but it turns out even if you create a complete vacuum, particles will manifest within the vacuum. It's impossible to create truly empty space. There is no such thing. Yeah, so even in physics, and of course even more so in our own minds. So yes, our practice then is learning to experience them accurately, right? So, and in the Theravada we talk about this in terms of Anata, right, the non-self. In the Mahayana we start to talk about this as the Tathagata, as the Buddha nature. And by the time we're practicing Vajrayana, we see that all phenomena, all experiences, we learn to see them as so-called pure perception. so beyond the scope of what we talk about today, but just to say, yes, it will continue to manifest, and we will just learn to relate to them very differently. Okay, Thierry has a question. My question is about meditation practice. I've been told that to fully accomplish shamatha is to remain focused on the object of meditation for 4 hours. I've been trying to increase the duration of my practice sessions, however I can't stand sitting for more than 45 minutes straight because I start to feel increasing pain in my knees. Although I try to contemplate that pain, feelings of tension and eagerness about the end of the session appear. Is this an obstacle to overcome, or am I pushing too hard? Should I reduce the sessions for 15 minutes, making more sessions each day? Or may I go practicing with my limited time, increasing little by little? So thanks, Thierry. I would say Rinpoche in his tradition does not teach a sort of extended standalone shamatha practice, right? He always teaches shamatha and vipassana together. And so I think the practice wouldn't really kind of go the way you're saying. If I understand, I'm guessing this is more along the lines that taught by teachers like Alan Wallace, right? Who has a real interest in teaching shamatha. And I know in his book, The Attention Revolution, he talks about the different stages of shamatha, but he says even from the 5th stage onwards, his practices are no longer the Theravada shamatha practice. They're much more like Dzogchen practices. And he says you wouldn't expect being able to sustain 4 hours straight until the 9th stage of samadhana, which is a very advanced stage of shamatha practice, right? I mean, Alan Wallace calls it attentional balance. And he specifically says, progressing beyond the 4th stage, right, bear in mind, this is the 9th stage, progress beyond the 4th stage requires a vocational commitment to this training, which may involve full-time practice for months or years at a stretch. Right, so just to say, Thierry, I think 15 minutes a day would not get you to this 4-hour shamatha of the 9th stage. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think if you really want to do what Alan Wallace is talking about, yes, I think you'll need to find a way to practice in much longer sessions, and I'm not quite sure what to advise for that. I guess it will be learning to work with other physical postures or finding a way of having greater comfort. I mean, Rinpoche has many students who are physically disabled and literally cannot sit, right? So have to sort of find other ways of practicing. I think the other thing you may wish to consider is whether you want to start integrating your shamatha with vipassana and have a practice of both of them together. And I think maybe then the nature of your question might change. Again, if given it's a personal practice question, it might be good. If you're interested, please reach out to me directly. There was a question from Max saying he vaguely recalls a talk from Dzigar Kocho Rinpoche where he commented that if you have a high school understanding of algebra, you can grasp Madhyamaka. And then it's also possible to experience a certain state of bliss from that understanding. He said, many years ago I studied the root text, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and I was a bad student, not in the right state of mind, but it just seemed repetitive and pedantic. So the question is, why do you think it might be difficult or perceived to be difficult? Is there some barrier to entry? Is the translation the problem? He said, I can imagine getting absorbed in solving a math problem, but my memories of Madhyamaka study were not as engaging. Why is that? He also said, any thoughts on doing a course on Gendon Chöpel's commentary? So big question. I think a lot of the traditional way Madhyamaka is studied in the Tibetan tradition is quite, potentially quite boring because it's a lot to do with the logic of the text itself, and there's not very much focus on application or practice. Rinpoche has taught the same text many times, and I find it much more enjoyable because he's always bringing it back to our practice in our everyday life. And I think for Westerners or for modern people, having that sense of a practical relevance and application, I think can be very helpful. But having said that, the topic of non-duality is intrinsically quite difficult. And as Rinpoche says, many, if not most people, struggle to see that it's there and it's not there at the same time. And in one way, you could say that's a very simple thing to see, and in another way, you could say it's a very difficult thing to say. I'm not sure that, to be honest, a high school understanding of algebra is going to help you one way or the other with that. But let's come back to that in week 6. Then there's a question from Fenna Ursula, but the question never made it into the form, so I don't know, Fenna Ursula, if you're still listening, but if you are, please ask your question again, because I can't see it. A question from Marina saying, please could you say a little bit about what Rinpoche might say about how to practice loving kindness and bodhicitta without falling into overly feeling self-deception? How can we try and correct the view without losing the understanding or feeling for the other person? Yeah, well, I think, so we'll talk about this a lot next week, but emptiness, right? Anata in the Theravada, non-self. I think in the Mahayana that gets extended to the idea of emptiness, where, as we said, things are both there and not there. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So we say the self is empty. It doesn't mean the self doesn't exist. It means that ultimately there is no such thing as a truly existing self. But relatively, of course, we still have a self. We have an identity. We have a name. We have a job. We have a partner, right? So the difference is, if we deconstruct this idea of a truly existing self, a truly independent self, then what we're left with is interdependence, right? We start to see we're no longer these heroic, isolated individuals, right? We no longer have this kind of narcissistic view, and we start to see that actually we are interconnected with other people, other animals, the environment, the planet, right? We start to experience this interconnectivity. Now, it's a little unfamiliar for most of us, especially because our limited understanding and imagination can't really take us beyond imagining maybe a couple of hundred people at a time, right? The idea of the tribal sizes that we evolved to get used to. I mean, we literally cannot visualize 100,000 people in a small city, let alone 100 million, let alone 8 billion. I mean, it's beyond our intuitive experience, right? That's part of the problem. So it's why we need to really meditate on interdependence, on common humanity, on seeing all beings as equal and developing caring and loving kindness for all beings. But to your question, Marina, what ends up happening if you cultivate the view is you realize it's non-self, which means you're left with interdependence, right? What you're left with is all beings become the source of your practice, right? Which is very much what happens in the Mahayana anyway. So it's not as if you're developing your compassion in competition with emptiness. Your compassion is actually a natural consequence of an understanding of emptiness, right? It's because you understand everything is interdependent, which is why you realize it's all worthy of your care and attention. Yeah. Okay, another question from Thierry. Is being mindful of the 5 aggregates the same as realizing there's no such thing as identity or personality? I mean, in a way, I mean, yes, and actually this is related to Elka's question, because she says, aren't the 4 Satipatanas 4 of the 5 skandhas? So the answer, Elka, to your question is no, they're not. They're actually different. They're 2 separate lists. I won't go into why in all the Buddhist scholarship that we have these different lists. Nevertheless, to Thierry's question, yes, if you are cultivating mindfulness of the 5 aggregates, you're probably going to end up cultivating mindfulness of the four Satipathanas as well. And if you are not just observing, as you said, not just the pasana, not just the seeing, not just the being mindful of their superficial characteristics. Remember, our aim is vipassana, right? Seeing something extra. Yeah. So if we are being mindful, we are always, aspiring to see the true nature, the anicca, dukkha, anatta, right? Impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self. And if we do that, whether it's with the five aggregates or the four Satipattanas, then yes, we will end up seeing that identity and personality are just constructions, right? We'll see their anatta nature, right? We'll see there is no true identity there. Right? Like we said in the very first week, I mean, the self is something that's changing all the time. We're not the same person we were when we were 5 years old or 10 years old, right? And it's just that fixation to self that causes the suffering. And at the same time, we're not being nihilistic either. We're not denying we have a relative conventional self, right? We're not denying that our words and actions have consequences in the world. Yeah. So this is the middle way. Ultimately, there is no identity, but relatively there is identity. So is there a meditation on consciousness? That's the final part of Elka's question. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Elka. I mean, if you mean, is that included in the mindfulness of mind, then yes, as we've already covered today. Francisco has a question. Can the practice of observing the observer reinforce the habit of self-grasping? I mean, absolutely, right? I think that's always the challenge, right? The difference between the pasana, the seeing, and the vipassana of seeing the nature. Because if through our observation we're not seeing the three marks, right? We're not seeing the anatta, then it's very possible we may just end up increasing our narcissism and self-grasping. Yeah? I mean, it's like you could say, observing the self, I could stare in the mirror all day long and, contemplate whether or not I need to sort of adjust my appearance. There's nothing about that that's Buddhist practice. Yeah? Observation on its own, without the vipassana, is not a Buddhist practice. Yeah? So remember, we're always trying to observe with the intention of seeing past the surface appearances, seeing the nature of the appearances, whether it is the self or the phenomena. Because if we don't, then yes, self-grasping may well be the consequence. There's a question from Teresa in the chat saying, in what ways is the philosophy of existentialism similar to Buddhism? That's a good question. In fact, there's quite some evidence that a lot of the well-known 20th century philosophers had access to some of the early 19th century translations of Buddhism, which in turn influenced their thinking. And we can certainly talk much more about all of that. So I would say the similarity is that existentialism would say, it was very much a reaction or a deconstruction of the idea that there is any true meaning or true purpose, right? And a realization that actually it is all constructed. There's a lot of deconstruction, a lot of living free from fixed codes. The idea that nobody else gets to determine what is right for us, right? A lot of sort of expression. I think perhaps the difference would be that existentialism tends to emphasize a lot the dimension of form is emptiness. So it does a lot of deconstructing an ultimate truth. I think the danger may be that it doesn't do the emptiness is form, right? So it's not a non-dual practice like Mahayana Buddhist practice. There's always the danger that one can become overly fixated on the purposelessness. I think we have this, Rinpoche talks about it as well, this idea of existential angst, right? This idea of the fear, the loathing, the depression that nothing means anything. And, some great existentialist authors like Sartre, I mean, they talked about suicide, right? They talked about, well, what is the point of even living when there is no point, right? I think that is a potential downside. And again, this is a much bigger question, but I think it is interesting if you look at a lot of people who have a strong religious belief, they're actually much happier. They're less prone to depression and anxiety because they have something fixed that gives their life meaning. A lot of people who have embraced existentialism and postmodernism, part of the challenge is they don't know how to reconstruct a conventional belief. They don't know how to build a life purpose, and it's very easy then to get lost in depression and anxiety. So I'd say that's the big difference, right? Because existentialism doesn't have the same set of form practices. It doesn't have the same emphasis on compassion practices. Yes, it deconstructs the self, but it doesn't in the same way, back to the earlier question from Marina, it doesn't in the same way build interdependence and emphasize all beings, right? So I think that absence of the emptiness as form, that absence of the compassion, I think becomes something that makes the practice into an extreme practice. So Shauna has a question. Can I clarify Rinpoche's view on the 9 stages of shamatha practice? Gosh, that's a great question. I don't know that he has ever taught, at least not to my knowledge, the 9 stages of shamatha. So I cannot clarify what his view might be. So I apologize for that. So that takes us to the end of questions in the chat and on the form. I'll just pause for a moment. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, I see no more questions. So once again, thank you. I look forward to seeing you all again next week.